Hello, and welcome back to the Student's Opinion. Today is the ninth episode of the podcast, and we are discussing the government's impact on education. When we talked to Uncle about education in Spain in our fourth episode, he explained how the government was influencing the curriculum and excluding important topics to keep the students oblivious to real issues and retain popular support. Today, we dive into this practice of the government setting the curriculum to advance its own political interests and agenda. Now, across the world, we can see that the governments implement nationalistic belief and values in every particular way that they can find. And one of the best ways, and perhaps even the most important ways that they do this, so that their voter bank or their beliefs are spread to the people, is through the implementation of their ideologies in the national curriculum. What better way to support a particular country than if the children learn about the grand and glorious ideologies that they can see that their country is implementing, which is essentially whitewashing them, and in fact might go as far as feeding them a single story view. That's right, a single story view. And for those who don't know what a single story is, it means giving a representation of only one side instead of the various other sides you can see from a story. And to support my point, instead of giving a holistic, broad, and understanding view of the knowledge of the world that we live in, many of these governments take the single story view and try to implement it into the nationalistic ideologies and the national curriculum. Now, Vineet, what are your thoughts and opinions about this?
Yes, so we are talking about how the government essentially, while creating the national curriculum for students to study, only presents one side of the story, especially in the social sciences. Because if you think about it, science and math are pretty much globalized subjects in a sense. So everybody across the world agrees on how science and math are and the concepts that are involved. So there's not much that a government can do in changing the way science concepts are presented in textbooks. But then when it comes to the social sciences like literature and history, civics, economics, mostly the former subjects, you have the government here which can put its own spin on events. Because at the end of the day, history is his story, it's recorded by somebody. So there is no real way to verify how accurate history is. And there are various versions of history written by different people who have seen it. And there's not really a way to check what has been written by each person. Say in India, we in sixth grade, when we really start studying history, we cover the ancient Indian times, which is before, if I recall correctly, before 8th century Common Era. Now, no one was alive back then. So there is, like, we have to just go by the sources, the archaeological sources we have found. Now, based on the sources that we have found, the government, in an attempt to show the country in a positive light, might change a few small details, but then every small change brings about like big ripples. It's like a butterfly effect that's happening, and that's presenting history in a completely different way. Now, for all we know, the government might be presenting the facts as accurately as they can, but then the fact is you just cannot verify it. So that gives the government a sort of power to change history and the way the social sciences are taught in a way to influence the students to look at them in a positive way. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I think so as well. And bringing up the point of history, I was suddenly remembered of one of the points that my history teacher had brought up in class 10. When if you're talking about history, let's dive into that. You are very familiar, and I hope our listeners are too, about the India-Pakistan partition. And interestingly, in our textbooks, while majority of the facts are retained the same, a bit of information is changed in favor for India, And if we compare that to the textbooks in Pakistan, in particular history textbooks which they use for their matriculation examinations over there, the facts are a bit inclined towards in say over Pakistan, because the books talk about how Pakistan attained freedom and talks about it from its own particular way and point of view, whereas the Indian textbooks also speak of it from another angle and another point of view. So yeah, when you say that there is no accurate representation of history, true, when we go back like hundreds and thousands of years back, there is, let's say, there is no particular source of information, only via the sources that we have or the things that we now know. We keep rediscovering and finding new things through archaeology, but what you say is true. No one really knows. And even if someone is alive, of the recent events that have taken place, or let's say approximately 100 years or before something that has happened, and people have seen and taken down, there's always going to be a bias on the person who writes down history. No two sources can be very similar, written by two completely different people. Although the facts or everything might be the same, there is going to be some underlying bias in terms of that particular thing for history, and that I think pushes towards nationalistic ideologies of the countries that they live in.
And another point I think we should consider is that even if you're not just looking at history, even if you're looking at present, say, media reportings of events, there is always that slight bias towards what the media wants to be presenting. Like a left leaning media bias might be more likely to present the story in a way that favors the workers, while a right leaning media site might present it in a way that favors conservative values. So, in that sense, even though the story is the exact same, the way it's presented and the effect that it has on the readers can be vastly different based on who is writing it. And if that just happens in newspapers and media that we read, then that can definitely happen in our schools, because the people who are writing out curriculums are also fallible to the same phenomenon of writing history or any subject that is subjective in a way that favors their worldview.
Yes, I think I completely agree with your point, Vineet, on the perspective of the fact that even our present day media can influence the way we think, the way we see. Let's look at the United States for an example over here as well, if you're talking about media. A lot of the presentations that the media does talks about the various policies that the government is implementing, and various media channels support different parties. If you're talking about the United States, particular, let's say, Channel A supports the Democrats, Channel B supports Republicans, and Channel C supports independent candidates. And let's say a law or a bill is being passed, and it will show it from that particular perspective of how that might impact. Now, if it favors, let's say, the Democrats, the Democratic channels will show, okay, so this and this is what you're going to get, this is what will happen if this bill passes. And the Republicans, if it does not favor them, the channels will then show these are the negative effects of the bill, this can't pass, this no, this is ridiculous, this bill is ridiculous. So yeah, media channels also influence, and I think media is one of the best examples of the 21st century of how it influences us. And I completely agree with the fact that if that happens to us, and that happens to people even now in the present day, excluding history, it can definitely happen to students, because young minds are molded very easily. And if the national curriculum is implemented to display ideologies, then it will definitely display that. Now, if you have heard, if our listeners know, I've presented a lot of examples of India, Pakistan, America, but I don't focus on those countries as a in general. Those countries, I just focus on them because I have some information on them. So today I'm going to explain to you another country that you might be familiar with. Now, while the examples that I have presented can be seen in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which are democracies in nature, but what about countries that are ruled by dictatorships, by single families, such as the North Korea, where the ideology is implemented even from the start to justify the ruling? Now, Article 43 of the North Korean Constitution states that the state shall embody the principles of socialist pedagogy so as to raise the rising generation to steadfast revolutionaries who will fight for society and the people, to the people of the new Jewish type who are acknowledgeable, morally sound, and physically healthy. In this context, revolution that North Korea has mentioned means sacrificing everything for the sake of the country, and more precisely for the dictatorship regime that is present, and becoming loyal to Kim Jong un's family. So, what do you think about this example that I presented, Vineet? What is your opinion on it?
Now, I think that's a very extreme example, or not exactly extreme, but a very conspicuous example of a government influencing the national curriculum. Most other countries tend to be more subtle with it, and they want to make it seem like the national curriculum is covering everything that the student needs to learn to have a chance to form their own worldview. But then again, like how North Korea is doing it, there is always going to be a little bit of bias that comes in when you're preparing the national curriculum. In North Korea, it might be very blatant that they're influencing the national curriculum, but then in other countries, like here in the United States, our curriculum is also influenced, and it usually tends to provide a pro America stance. And that involves not discussing other histories like Native American history and other countries' history, but focusing solely on Americans and the impact that they have had on the world. And I can recall from last year when I studied US history, when we were covering topics like World War I and World War II, much of the focus was on the US's involvement, though it did not play as big a role as some of the European countries. So, in that sense, even countries like the US are able to influence national curriculums to further the view that the politicians or the people in power want the students to have.
True, I completely agree with that, and that is going to be my next point. And to say that it's not only North Korea who has a dictatorship regime that is at fault over here in the implementation of nationalistic ideology. And while I completely agree with you, Vineet, the fact that while North Korea might be quite blatant to say that we influence the national curriculum, let's take the United States of America for an example and see how it influences its nationalistic ideologies. Now, Michael S. Murray had written in his paper Patriotism, History, and the Legitimate Aims of American Education from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And he states that, quote, that caveat aside, and apart from the legitimate functions that sever, American public schools and history textbooks they use to aid in the cultivation of an uncritical patriotic disposition. Close quote. He even further states that this uncritical patriotic disposition, what I will call loyal patriotism, countenances a view of the United States in its past and present that reflects only its most conservative, read self preserving tendencies, and too commonly asked that students consider only American quote unquote blessing and not its many Scrooges. Now, considering that world's people look up to the United States of America when things happen, when disaster strikes, it's a world power, if I can say so myself. Now, even though it might not be blatantly mentioned in the US Constitution or anywhere in the particular constitutions that each state has in the United States, it can be seen though. And to all our listeners, I would just like to say I'm not against nationalistic ideologies being implemented. If you're living in a particular country, it is your right and and you're justified to be patriotic for your country. All I'm saying is the fact that maybe sometimes governments push these ideologies through education just a bit too far, just to increase the voter pool, so that the future of those nations, that is our listeners, will vote for those countries, because they will listen to them and be like, okay, so this is what my government has done in the past, so let me vote to make sure that my country is the best in what it does and what my country can do.
Yes, mate. So I do think that it's not just nationalistic ideologies that the countries are trying to push, it's also political ideologies and facts that are favorable to the government. And in a sense, it's a form of censorship where you're censoring the details that do not portray the ruling government in a favorable condition, or as we were speaking in general terms, that do not portray the country in a favorable light. So, how much this should be allowed? I don't think anyone can regulate it, but as students, I think we can ask for it to be kept to a bare minimum. We should have a right to know the truth, and that truth, as we discussed at the start of the episode, nobody really knows it. So we're in a catch-22 situation here. We don't know what the truth is, but we want the truth. And if the government says it's giving us the truth, are they lying to us, or or are they actually telling us the truth? Right? So that's a paradox that exists, and I really cannot see a way to resolve it. But what do you have to say about that?
Yes, I completely agree with you, Vinny. There is definitely a paradox, and I think the Netherlands has a solution for this, and I think it has been very well implemented. Now, in my global politics class, I recently learned a very interesting case study about blackfacing. Now, to those who aren't aware of what blackfacing is, on December 5th, which is the eve of St. Nicholas's birthday, it's a long-standing tradition in the Netherlands, and a couple of years back, people blackface themselves to celebrate the festival, because it celebrated the visit of Sinterklaas and Zwart Piet, which is Dutch for Black Peter. Now, by blackfacing themselves, this was a clear sign of disregard of the sentiments of the African community, and it affected them. We have seen a large number of cases where parents don't want to send their children during that day, because all of their other kids will come blackface and will be coming to school. Now, but such a tradition now questions the educational impact that it leaves on students. Now, keeping in mind that education and culture are both intertwined. Thankfully, now, due to a large number of protests and challenges, not only on a domestic scale, but also on an international level, with local anti racism activists holding protests and Black Lives Matter becoming an international movement, the Kingdom of Netherlands started rethinking their cultural standpoint that it had regarding this particular festival. And presently, in Netherlands, slowly but surely, the change has been implanted, with a large number of provinces and municipalities banning blackfacing, which goes on to educate people about the glaring inequalities of the country's minority population, and the country's history with slavery, and also those who firmly believe that their tolerant and liberal society offers equality to all. And as a result, I believe this is one of the best examples of how the paradox is broken, and how the education on a holistic level starts challenging the nationalistic ideologies implemented by the government or by the country itself.
Yes, so Medhansh, that's a very interesting case study you brought up. But then throughout the case study, the only thing I could think of was that this is a very narrow example. I'm not discrediting your point, but I'm saying that it's a very narrow example in the sense that there are millions of instances of the government changing the way history is taught to favor their agendas. And then this is just one of the ways where it did not work out. And I think even with the way the modern society is progressing, there would be more protests and changes to the way the government influences education. But then at the moment, this is a very small step, but it's a step in the right direction nevertheless. And there are so many ways in which the government is influencing it. And I can recall so many ways in just the United States. So the way the civil rights activists are whitewashed to portray a more moderate character that benefits the status quo is one of the biggest examples. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we'll be celebrating next week as Martin Luther King Day. Right now, his ideology has been condensed into just the I Have a Dream speech and how people should be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But that's not the only thing Dr. King stood for. He also stood for socialism, for uplifting the working class. And all of those ideologies of Dr. King are just lost because they don't seem to benefit the status quo. What they do seem to focus on is just the racism part and how he fought that. And even that is heavily condensed. So, in that sense, a lot of the government is trying to make sure that the students get educated and they know only the information that they need, which will also help the government retain its hold on children's minds. And that's what I think is the problem. We should be aiming for a more diverse curriculum, a curriculum where you're allowed to explore multiple sides of the story. Because again, as we discussed at the start, we don't know the truth. So we got to have different viewpoints so that we can get as close to the truth as possible. When you have different people, say a Native American, an African American person, Asians, and all of them come together and tell their stories, then you're able to look at the different facets from each story and you're able to see what might have transpired. Now, that still might not be true, but that's much better than just having one person's side of the story. Just like in debate, we want to hear both sides argue, not just one side. Because if you listen only to one side, you're going to be biased to that person. That's why you need both sides of the story.
True, and I completely agree with your points as well. While I certainly feel that the point that you brought about of Martin Luther King being just condensed to his iconic I Have a Dream speech and not celebrated for the actual struggle that he has actually done and his ideologies. I feel that presently the different governments across the world, the main idea is to educate children on how their country is the best. No, because okay, let me ask you this directly, Vineet. When you were small, did you and when you saw movies and when you read books about India, didn't you think that it was one of the best nations in the world? It fought off the British. Yes, I mean my Mera Desh Mahan, my country's the best. Didn't you think like that?
I don't really remember, but I do have some vague memories of having those sort of nationalistic feelings that it's my country's the best in the world. So, in that sense, the government has done a good job of instilling the nationalistic sense. But then, what I believe the government is doing is that it's taking it a bit too far and it's making us chauvinists rather than just being nationalists.
True, and I completely agree with your point as well over there, in the sense that while implementing nationalistic ideology into the national curriculum, having a particular bias, let's say, towards your own country is all right, it's fine, because that bias implements you having the love that you have for your own nation, for your own country, so that you can grow as an individual, so that you can be patriotic about your country. Even if you go outside, you're reminded about the country that you used to live in, and you're reminded of it. But I completely agree with you on the point that perhaps a large number of these countries and their governments, in fact, are to blamed over here, that they are taking their national ideologies a bit too extreme into the national curriculum, and as a result molding and influencing children in particular ways. And that can be clearly seen as well in the social sciences, as you had mentioned when this podcast first started.
Yeah, and another point I would like to bring up is with respect to nationalism. Each country has at least some amount of study material about nationalism in their own country. For example, in 10th grade, we had this chapter in history about nationalism in India, where we were portrayed as how Indians were cruelly treated by the British and how we had to fight for over 200 years to get our independence. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then there as well, we're only shown the story from the Indian's perspective, not from the British perspective. So we're unable to get a clear idea about what really transpired. Now, the textbooks might be telling the truth, and I'm not doubting the textbooks here. I'm just saying that having that other point of view would help us be able to make more informed decisions, because what you do in school is what you do outside in the real world. And in the real world, you have to be able to look at different viewpoints and choose what's the best. You can't just be looking at one biased source.
True. And especially with the point of debate that you brought up, I think that summarizes the discussion that we're trying to make, or the fact that instead of having only the single story ideology, which is really harmful if you do have a single story ideology, it's best to be aware of the multiple sides that one particular story or a case study might have, because only then can you make a more or less unbiased decision or an unbiased documentation of what goes on and what happens, so that future generations know what has taken place. And yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, same. Even I think I have exhausted whatever I wanted to say on this topic. It's a very interesting topic, though. All of us have our own different viewpoints, and I would like to ask our listeners to let us know what they think about the topic as well, and whether the government is playing too big a role in education and, in a sense, making education way more nationalistic than it needs to be, and also not presenting all the facts to help students gain a good understanding of history and the social sciences.
And with that, we conclude our ninth episode here on the student's opinion. This episode is exclusively available on Spotify for the first 2 days, after which it will be available on YouTube, Amazon Music, and Google Podcasts. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel to be notified when future episodes dropped, and comment on what you thought of this episodes. If you do have any suggestions or ideas for what we should discuss next, be sure to email us at contact.thestudentsopinion@gmail.com. For now, it is Vineet and I signing off.